This is the Formula 44 installation guide. For the installation guide, I will be working on the red-bodied Typhon Grom, but the kit can be printed to color match any Typhon body or to create a totally custom color scheme. The first step is to remove all of the elements that we do not need in the final build, as well as some items that will be used later on. The kit is non-destructive and doesn't change or modify any part, and is all about removing or swapping pieces. For now, we'll set the body aside and remove the small nose piece as well, and screw, as it will not be needed in the final build. Next is to remove the whole rear wing assembly. There are 4 screws holding the rear wing supports. The final screw is a little tricky, as depending on your tool, you might run into the heatsink on the motor. It is a good idea to screw the 4 screws back into the wing supports, as we will not need any of the original rear wing parts or reusing any of the screws. The F44 kit files include front and rear rims that were designed to fit Tamiya F103 and F104 rubber tires. It is also possible to use most 12mm hex 110 touring car wheels, as well as there is clearance for the diameter of that wheel. After removing the wheels, we need to remove the stock shocks, as the final build will use 3D printed compliant springs and arms that function to both set the correct ride height and control the suspension travel, which stiffens the suspension and requires more of the tires, just like in real F1 cars. The roll hoop assembly requires removing parts of the rear hook of the Grom's quick release body system. When the build is complete, the quick release system will still function just as before. Remove the 2 plates and insert the roll hoop pieces. Make sure to press them firmly together when screwing. Do not over-tighten the screws, as doing so could open up the 3D print and make the screws loose. The compliant spring and arms will need additional screws to link them, but do use the same mounting screws as the stock shocks. Both the front and the rear springs are mounted in the same way, with the posts of the springs facing inside the vehicle and the posts of the arms facing outward. The last bit of disassembly is to remove the bumper or skid blocks from the bottom of the Grom. Be careful, as these pieces also hold on the rods that mount the suspension arms to the chassis, but I have found that when handling the Grom, they are not so loose and they don't just fall out. The pieces themselves will not be reused, but we will reuse all of the screws to mount the front and rear wing assembly later on. The last step here is to attach the printed wheels, which will require Tamiya F103 or F104 tires as mentioned before, but it will also work with most standard 12mm hex 110 touring car wheels as well. You can now set the car aside as we will build the three main sub-assemblies of the floor, front, and rear wings. Each side pod is made of 3 pieces and requires that they all line up when mounting to the floor. The assembly requires additional M2.5 hardware. I will link a screw set that features all the screws required for this build. Again, be careful not to over tighten any screws going into 3D printed plastic, else it will open up the hole and make the connection loose. The inner side pod piece should line up at the front intake to help with alignment when mounting to the floor. Once both side pods are assembled, set the screws into the floor a little to help align the holes. The red pieces should face the same direction as the U or wide V shape. Mounting the floor assembly to the bottom of the Grom will require double-sided mounting tape. 3M VHB 1-inch wide works very well and holds perfectly while also making removing relatively easy without breaking anything. The floor does not require a lot of tape to securely hold on, and using less tape will also make it easier to remove later when converting back to stock or changing damaged parts. We can now set the floor aside and begin on the front wing and nose cone section. The front wing assembly will also require additional M2.5 screws, as well as using 2 screws removed from the top of the front bumper piece. The main piece used to mount the front wing assembly to the chassis is labeled as the front bulkhead, and the front wing is built off of that piece. Once again, do not over tighten the screws into the 3D printed parts, or they will open up and become loose. We can also set the screws removed from the Grom front bumper into the front bulkhead, but do not go all the way down yet. The front wing end plates are separated pieces because the livery this model is based on only had paint on the outer panels of the front and rear wings. To achieve the best fit, the 2 pieces should be mirrored to the inside of each other so that the pieces are perfectly flat to each other when assembling. The screws can be set into the end plates to help with aligning to the wing. The red piece of the nose cone is not hard mounted, but is held in place using a tab and slots on the lower nose section and clamped down by the nose cone which is mounted to the lower nose with the screw. Make sure to slot the upper flap into the grooves of the lower nose piece to ensure a tight fit and to align the holes for the nose cone. With the screw in, the red piece is now secured in place and the front wing assembly is complete. We can now set this aside and begin work on the rear wing and diffuser. The rear wing assembly does not use any of the original hardware that we removed earlier and will require additional M2.5 screws. Just like with the front wing end plates, the rear wing end plates should be printed mirror to be flat to each other. But in this case, the rear wing end plates do have a left and right as they feature grooves for the main wing plane and flap. Again, we can set the screws in to help with connecting the plates later. The rear bulkhead, wing support, rear diffuser, and gearbox are now all sandwiched together to form the core block of the wing that will mount to the chassis. Depending on print settings, the rain light may fit with friction, but I would recommend using a little bit of glue to hold it in, especially if running over less than smooth surfaces. The main wing plane can now be mounted to the support beams. Make sure to mount the end plates in the correct side and to align the wing planes into the grooves. We now have all sub-assemblies complete, so it is time to mount everything to the chassis. The body is straightforward and works just as it did before with the quick release system. I recommend using tweezers to remove the tape backing from the VHB, as it can still be pretty sticky to remove by hand. Line the middle of the floor with the front of the base near the 2 points of the Y shape, making sure that the back of the floor is not touching the rear suspension arms. Push down on the tape sections to secure the floor. The front wing assembly can now be slotted on, making sure that the front bulkhead section is pushed all the way in and aligning with the holes underneath. Use all the original hardware from the front bumper. Secure the front wing to the chassis. The rear wing assembly slots in just as the front did, and the underside can be mounted using the screws that we removed earlier from the rear bumper. The top of the rear bulkhead is a little tricky as the compliance spring is in the way, but the spring can be unscrewed to make room to fit a screwdriver down into position. We can then reattach a spring and the build is complete.